Hello there and welcome back to the Libertarian Listener. In this edition we've got Ben Truman, who is the Leicestershire County Group Leader for the Libertarian Party. It's great to have you on the show.
Brilliant to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
That's okay. And the first subject for today is the coronavirus, and this has not been out of the headlines for the past 2 weeks. So the first question I have for you is, do you believe that the coronavirus outbreak is of crisis proportions?
I certainly would do, watching the mainstream media news trying to scare everyone out of their minds by the looks of it. They've managed to succeed at scaring everyone into their house. But looking at certain experts, it doesn't appear, or at least we can't tell because we haven't had the majority of testing in, that it is such a problem. It's going to be more of a problem for the economic impacts if Boris Johnson continues in shutting our economy down and forcing quite a lot of small to medium businesses completely out.
Yeah, I know it's obviously been classified as a pandemic, but the death rate from the coronavirus at the moment is not as high as flu, is not as high as cancer so far this year. Do you think that the media has placed far too much of an emphasis on coronavirus?
I certainly do. I believe it may be due to a bit of a perfect storm. Because of that, media needs to have eye-grabbing headlines now. So it almost incentivizes them to come up with more shocking things so people click and generate them quite a lot more money than they would normally do. Because we both know that print media has dropped through the floor. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy to create the false news that we've got.
What do you think the social impacts of this coronavirus is going to be? Because obviously, to take an example from me earlier today, I was going around the shop and this woman was doing her level best to stay 2 meters away from me, even though I display none of the symptoms of coronavirus. What do you think the social implications of social distancing is going to be?
I think they're going to be quite dire if things go on. I don't really like the word social distancing either because it has such bad connotations to it. I think it should be called physical distancing. And you're right, people are acting very strange about trying to keep their distance with each other in the shops. It's going to cause all kinds of problems. We were in York a couple of weeks ago and we noticed a shop that was giving away free drinks. And myself and my partner both thought that may be something we won't see when we get out of this because people will take such stringent measures to stop this happening again. And it could completely change what we think is normal now.
Yeah, because a lot of our interactions now have got to be done online. We can't obviously communicate in person. And social media in particular has been notably linked to bad mental health. So what effect is this lockdown going to have on cases of mental illness?
I think it's going to increase it greatly. There's quite a lot of studies that show if you're in isolation, and especially if you are elderly, which unfortunately is the vulnerable people for COVID, it actually decreases your lifespan quite a bit. So it's not good things in the future if it carries on going the way that it is.
What do you think of the government strategy so far? Because obviously the original strategy was to adopt the herd immunity strategy, which would have meant that 60% of our population would have got infected and potentially 1.5 million people could have died. But now they've obviously changed that to a very extreme position so that they've locked down the UK. All of the non-essential businesses are shut. The strategy hasn't really been very clear or coherent.
No. I think when they first started, the evidence that they were basing all their policy on was actually quite good. It came out of Imperial College in London, and it stated that we could lose up to 250 million people if we didn't have all these measures in place. So the government took that, ran with it, and this is what we've got now. Imperial College have since downgraded their estimation of deaths by around 25 times. So they're now saying that we could lose about 20,000 people. But for whatever reason, the government are not reacting to that news. They're still carrying on like this is the worst thing ever and we're going to lose 250 million people. I think the US government are also following that policy, which is going to be quite damaging. I think we both agree with that.
It certainly doesn't take account of the differing rates of infection. Obviously, the US until very recently had a lower rate of infection than even the UK, but over the past week or so, they have become the most infected country in the world. Do you think that the government strategies around the world are resilient to the changing nature of the coronavirus?
No. I think this is unprecedented, and mainly governments are thinking of two things. One, they need to make sure they get re-elected next season, and two, they need to try and save as many people as possible, and they don't want to be blamed for screwing it up. So maybe they're overreacting because they haven't got measures in place to follow, because no one's been in this situation before. I don't think they are in a position to help themselves or each other. Just look at what's happening in the EU now. I think Germany refused to ship some masks that Italy obviously desperately need, which is kind of blowing up the idea of multiple nations altogether moving in the same direction. So it's exposing a lot of narratives that have always been pushed forward over the decades. We've been in relatively peaceful times with nothing particularly to worry about.
Because it's a bit worrying as well that the EU doesn't really have a strategy. Because I haven't heard anything in the news about the EU's strategy to deal with the coronavirus is this.
No. All the nations within the EU have decided to go off on their own and do what they seem fit. It's not got the binding effect that they've always said. They're also shutting borders down, which goes in direct contradiction to what the EU has always said is the best thing, which is open borders, everyone moving between the different countries, and it's basically leaving the EU potentially with no rule over the countries. And it shows that when the worst happens, it's much better to reduce the government size and do what you can for your local people and your local country. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that the coronavirus will be the big white flag for the EU. I think it's been defeated. And the value of the nation state is resurgent because we are seeing borders being closed. We are seeing countries standing alone. Just to move it on a bit, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has said that the number one priority for dealing with the coronavirus is testing, testing and testing. Do you think it's a little bit alarming, the fact that here in Britain we haven't really been taking testing seriously? So we haven't been distributing the face mask quickly enough. We're not wearing the disposable gloves. We're not doing temperature checks and things like that.
It is alarming in the fact that the government are making out that this thing is massively damaging, which it is. We are seeing several people die, but they've not been able to react in time. We haven't got the temperature testing. And more importantly, we're not having the actual testing, so we can't actually see how much of the population has been infected. So they're failing on quite a lot of fronts. But I wouldn't hold all that at the government's feet, because I think one of the main things that will change moving forward is the just-in-time methodology that is employed throughout the NHS and obviously many companies. The idea that you can only have a certain amount of items in your stock that's going to last maybe 2 or 3 months, because you always know you can reach out through these brilliant logistical systems and get the things more or less on a next day basis. So it's not all the government's fault, but I don't think they've acted in the best way they could have done.
So it's a lot to do with the organisational structure of the NHS and not all down to the commands of the government. I know obviously in South Korea there's been disinfection squads going around, and in many other countries there's borders been closed. Britain hasn't closed its borders and is now going to repatriate British citizens who are currently abroad. Do you think that this is essentially an open wound in the fight against the coronavirus?
I think it depends on how they approach it. If they were to say, right, we're not going to repatriate any of our citizens, that's obviously going to cause uproar, because I think Dominic Raab only mentioned today that it's not a matter of hundreds or thousands of people that are trying to get home. It's tens of thousands of people. They could do it properly if they implemented checks at the borders, like temperature checks, and more importantly, actually testing to see if people have got it or not. But from what we've seen over the last few weeks, I don't think they're going to put those measures in place. One being, I don't think they've got the equipment to do it. They need people that are trained and available when we need those people in the hospitals. So I can't see it going that brilliantly, to be honest.
Do you agree with the government's politically laced message, stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, when there's the contribution from the private sector that's also been overlooked and sidelined?
I've actually been classed as a key worker. So I am one of those people that are trying to be out on the road and helping out hospitals and stuff. Doesn't particularly bother me that they're not talking about the private sector. I think they've done it because they needed a clear and consistent message to get people to do what they want them to do. Because it would confuse things if they said, oh, Honeywell or an electrics company is trying to keep the power on or something like that. They just went down that line because it's easy to repeat. Doesn't particularly worry me. It's working for them from their perspective, I suppose.
So if you listen to most expert doctors and things like that, what they're saying, the message from them is that the disease spreads more effectively in closed spaces. So what do you think the impact will be within people's own homes if someone gets infected? And surely it would be better to keep us outside in open spaces. But unfortunately, the government's policies are not really taking that into account.
I think it won't go well. I think there's been a documented case in South Korea of, I think, a few hundred people were in an enclosed space and they rapidly infected everybody within that one office building. I think it's a bit daft how the police seem to be taking it upon themselves to, I don't know if this is true, you might be able to tell me this, they keep floating the idea of only being allowed outside for 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's in relation to physical exercise. The daily allowance been 30 minutes outside of the house in the local area.
It's worrying. It's not great. There's no evidence that you can catch it being out in an open space. I know Derbyshire police appeared to have completely overstepped the mark and spent quite a long time tracking one man and his dog walking through the Derbyshire Dales. Pretty funny because if you know about how to operate these reasonable sized drones, normally you need up to 3 people to operate them. So they were standing in close proximity while moaning at some poor guy up a hill just trying to walk his dog. So it's a bit stupid.
Are we living in a police state right now? Has this lockdown been the impetus to release the powers of the police?
I think it has. I think there's certain people within the government, I'm not saying all, but there's obviously some people that are going to try and use this crisis as some kind of test. You know, there's going to be studies done from this within the government to see how the public react and how far they can push them. If you were in that position and you were a psychologist within the government and you know you have to plan for all eventualities, why wouldn't they use it as an excuse to say, OK, we can see how many people will stay in their house, how many people are going to react badly to it. And I think they've demonstrated that they are going to play with it because they've put the restrictions in place for 2 years. Is that correct?
Up to 2 years, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense because what you'd do is you'd have it for a few months and then you'd look back and say, OK, do we need to lift it now? Why put in 2 years?
Because I know one of the things that people don't really like to admit is that the police is there for the protection of the state and its assets. It's not really there for the protection of the people. Do you think what we've seen, what with all these neighbours dobbing in neighbours for going out on 2 walks a day, do you think that the police are becoming overzealous?
I think they are. But then we look at the KPIs that are being put on them and the amount of staff that they've lost. Maybe it's actually easier for them to go down that route and to say, right, we're just going to follow what the government tells us, and it's going to be easier for us to deploy that and go in that direction because we could use certain easy technology to surveil a whole dale. That point just made than helping. It's interesting. I saw a tweet. I forget which police area that came from, but basically they made a joke and said, right, we've just been granted all these police powers. How can we mess with people today? And they had a massive backlash and they had to delete the tweet. But it is extremely worrying watching people react and start telling on each other and phoning the police and saying, oh, so-and-so's gone for a walk 2 days. That's the thing that worries me the most.
I'm not really one to watch daytime TV, but I saw someone on a programme saying, at the end of this crisis, your neighbour will still be your neighbour. And once all of this is over, you've got to get back to normal as best as you can. So all of these people who are saying these things and grassing are essentially doing themselves no favour for when this crisis is over.
They're not. And it makes you wonder how far it can go and what more the government can ask of people and how far will people grass each other up. It's scary to think about. And we know that bad things have happened in other countries in the past where people have ratted each other out. I guess we could track it out if things get worse.
Do you think it sort of demonstrates as well the lack of community that is now present within Britain? If people are willing to use the police for meaningless issues like this?
I think it is, yeah. People aren't talking to their neighbours anymore, especially in the big cities. They're not as friendly to each other. because there's so many people now always on top of each other, even in the little town that I live in, it brings the worst out in people. But then on the flip side, there is a lot of people that are reaching out. I don't know if you've heard of the application called Nextdoor, where you could join it and you can just talk to your neighbours in your local community. And there's been a lot of messages within my estate and parts of the town I'm in that are saying that if you need to get any food, are you one of the vulnerable, we'll help you out. So, right. Yeah, it's quite encouraging, but then also a little upsetting because it does bring the selfish people and the idiots out.
Do you think that there's going to be any real desire for the police to abandon their powers once this coronavirus crisis is out the way?
I think it depends on how it goes. If it goes well, then they could hold it up and say, look, we fixed it because we gave the police the powers. We need to keep this in place in case it ever happens again. I don't know, how many times does a government roll back any powers that they've managed to get hold of? I don't think they have they?
I was just going to say, yeah, because I was having a conversation the other day with someone on Facebook. I said, when has the government ever really relinquished any of its powers? And the fact is, it hasn't.
No.
Do you think that the public disobedience, the people who are going out despite all of these warnings, reflects a naturally libertarian nature within the people of Britain?
I think it does, yeah. People are seeing what's actually happening and tracking it, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously. They're basically trying to be an individual and they are taking steps to protect each other, not particularly being daft. The majority of people anyway. There's always going to be a small minority of people that just can't be helped. But you've got to hope, and well, I think you can see in certain more libertarian countries than us that generally individuals do the right thing and do help each other out. I can't remember if it's Sweden or Switzerland. They didn't shut all the bars and the restaurants down, did they?
And it seems
to be going well for them. I don't know if they've changed their stance recently, but that's the kind of thing I would have liked to see our country do.
Because obviously the effects of this lockdown won't be felt until 2 weeks after it was introduced, so we should be seeing in this week coming whether this lockdown has actually worked. If it hasn't worked, what do you think the alternative is then?
If it hasn't worked, so if we haven't seen a drop in infections and deaths?
Yes.
I think they're going to roll out a full lockdown. They're going to react with what people are going to be saying, and people are going to basically get scared. And they're going to go, okay, then we can make people not scared by locking it down. You've already been telling on each other and telling us how badly people are taking it. And they're going to use examples of a small amount of people going to the pub or going down the park and push it even further. I don't know what you think they're going to do.
I think, to be honest, what they've shown so far is that they're willing to fight fire with fire. So I think what little liberty we have left for now, they will get rid of.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen what's happening in Italy now. They've started deploying armed troops and police around the streets, guarding supermarkets and stuff, because people aren't following it well.
So there is some hope, but there are many dark days to come.
Yes, definitely.
What do you think the dangers are of people's newfound reliance on the mainstream media, considering that there's now a lot of people who have been furloughed and are now sat at home? They're getting all of their information from the mainstream media. What do you think the negative implications of that's going to be?
We'll go back to the old days where everyone believes whatever the mainstream media put out. A lot of misinformation. I say misinformation, I'd say misrepresentation of information. So certain media agencies will leave out convenient facts. Have we seen an uptick in people watching mainstream media then?
Apparently the viewing figures for the major TV channels are rising.
That's disappointing.
Essentially, then the problem will be that it will crowd out the truth-telling media outlets that are not mainstream.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I get a lot of fascinating information from YouTube, particularly, where the experts just go directly to the people and set their own channel up and present all the information, and they can talk for, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours, a lot better than the mainstream. But yeah, it's going to be definitely damaging if people start following that, just because of the amount of things they get wrong or over-exaggerate.
Well, as a prime example of that is that the king of fake news, that is the BBC, put out a story about Chloe Middleton. Basically, her death was falsely attributed to the coronavirus by a coroner, Now, The Guardian has retracted it and has put it under review, but the BBC still has that article out there on the website, spreading misinformation. Do you think there's going to be more instances of that throughout the crisis?
Yeah, they'll try and get the headline first, and then they will fail to fact check, and then they'll try and get on to the next thing that will come out about COVID. So it will just be a terrible effect of more and more misinformation and fake news being put out there. Yeah, it's not going to go well.
What do you think we can do as libertarians to sort of help ensure that people get the right information?
We'll need to simplify but not misinform certain headlines. That maybe pick the top 5 headlines of the week and then find the sources and then come up with, I don't know, Instagram posts, things to share throughout social media that can't be disputed, because people react very well to single pictures or videos. Come up with some simple arguments for libertarianism, but not necessarily promoting the idea of libertarianism, but knowing that it is on that track. We've really got to put our heads together and come up with a good plan. Otherwise, we're going to be drowned out, and the globalists will start winning and saying it would not have happened if all the countries were working together and we could have shut down all the borders or implemented the tests across all the different countries.
So how did you become a libertarian? What was your journey towards the libertarian ideology?
It's quite a long journey. Initially, I thought I was quite left. The right was particularly evil. Any kind of lunatic libertarians, I thought they were like gun-toting nutters, to be honest. But thinking back, I always believed in small government, but I wasn't able to put 2 and 2 together. And on my journey, as I got older, I started to realise that I wasn't actually left. I wasn't interested in the government controlling ourselves. And I wanted more freedom, especially freedom of speech. Nowadays, freedom of speech is scarily looked down upon. And you always mention freedom of speech and they always think you're some kind of crazy Nazi. Scarily enough, a lot of the young people, especially people coming out of the universities, are arguing against freedom of speech, which isn't great. So on my journey, I realised I was what I'd define as maybe a classical libertarian or something like that. I only discovered that about 2-3 years ago. Right. And then we were coming up to an election. I could not bring myself to vote Labour, even though I'm primarily a Labour voter all my life. And I also couldn't bring myself to vote Conservative. And those are the 2 things that I thought were the only options until I pulled down the candidate list from our local council and saw there was such a thing called the Libertarian Party, in which I got extremely excited, straight to their website, signed up, reached out to them, asked them if there's anything I could possibly do to help them out, got in contact with Dan Lidicott, and the rest is history. Nice. So it's only relatively recently, basically.
And was it more of a natural progression, perhaps seeing what authoritarian parties were espousing and not agreeing with it?
It was a natural progression in the sense of how I came to this point over the years. And then everything I decided I was and I wanted, the Libertarian Party was hammering out everything that I agreed with. I was so excited when I was reading through their manifesto. All the policies kind of matched up to how I think a good government should move forward.
So how do you think the Libertarian Party can proliferate its message to a wider audience, considering that people are stuck with the old Labour versus Conservatives?
The one problem that I've come across is people see the Libertarian Party as American. And as soon as I've started to talk to anybody, be them Conservative or Labour, they've always said, we don't want to be like Americans. They're having loads of problems with gun deaths, for instance. And then they look at the manifesto and they see something about guns and immediately they shut down. So the other thing I saw when we mention about states, that's also another thing. They're like, well, that's America. We don't want to be America. Because the layman just watches mainstream media. They see a lot of problems that's happening in America with their healthcare, for instance, and the gun deaths. And they immediately think, I don't want to be like that. Sorry, I can't entertain the idea of voting Libertarian. So we need to get over that.
Yeah. Do you think it's not helped as well by the fact that the Libertarian Party in America, Gary Johnson, is not really that much of a libertarian? So it's harming the image of libertarianism in other countries.
It may well be, but I wouldn't imagine many people know who Gary Johnson is.
I was just thinking about if someone were to search for the Libertarian Party, it would come up with Gary Johnson and his ilk. And he is not really the best representative at all of what libertarianism really is.
He has got some crazy ideas, I give him that. Then they are the third biggest party in the country, aren't they? They have come a long way since, was it the 70s or something like that they originally got set up?
It hasn't really done anything for a very long time, and then it's had a massive surge upwards. Do you think that the same sort of thing can happen here with the Libertarian Party?
I think we've got a better chance than any time prior, especially with Brexit, and especially now while Labour is busy killing themselves off, eating themselves. But the way that Conservatives are going, Boris has got such a massive approval rating at the moment.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're just going to be left in the dust. Meanwhile, everyone's being hoodwinked to go to a more authoritarian country and not really knowing it.
It's a bit of a stab in the back, really, because he espoused all of these sort of classical liberal policies and things like that at various points in his political career, but he's never really been tied down to any ideology or any position or any one measure. Because even to take Brexit as an example, he joined the Leave bandwagon rather late. Do you think we can trust Boris to do the right thing?
Oh, I don't know. If it was to him, I think maybe. You look back in time and what he's wrote, he seems like quite a libertarian. But the powers behind him and the way that he's being pushed, I think now he's being forced into a situation that I don't think he likes to be in. I really noticed that on the first few speeches that they did around COVID, where he was in the middle and you could see that the two chaps either side of him, was it Chris and Patrick?
Yeah.
They didn't seem worried or scared. They seemed quite confident and they seemed like everything was in hand and they were giving us all the data and all the numbers. And yet, in the middle, Boris was visibly upset, something that you don't really see from him. He was playing with his hands, swaying a little bit, and I couldn't work out why. And then I thought it might not be the virus he's worried about. It's actually the steps that he's being asked to take just a few weeks down the road and the impact on the economy to potentially save all these people. And maybe that was why he was so stressed. I don't know what your take on it was.
I think I'd be in broad agreement with that. Whatever the next 4 years brings, there will certainly be economic hardship. We've had now a whole decade where spending levels have risen, where tax levels have risen, and there hasn't really been the government around or the Prime Minister around until now to really have a shot at turning that round. I think the major problem here is that this COVID-19 will just overtake everything, and it's going to send us into recession. We know that. We just don't know how deep it's going to be. It's just going to unwind all of the potential progress he can make.
What worries me now, particularly today, is there's a lot of information coming out from a lot of high-level medical institutions which are now downgrading the models that initially got set up a few weeks ago. The head guy went in front of Parliament and explained his situation. He said, look, the model that we had doesn't appear to be accurate, doesn't match any country. The predictions that we made are wrong. So this is a new prediction we've made. But the government are still hell-bent on shutting the economy down.
Just to backtrack slightly, are there any major libertarian thinkers that you read or listen to at all?
One of the main ones was Thomas Jefferson. I read his biography. Thought that was fascinating. He's one of the greats.
I think it was Jefferson who said, a man who reads nothing but newspapers will be less educated than a man who reads nothing at all. Or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. We don't appear to have any great libertarian thinkers that are massively known and well respected.
Which is quite sad and quite ironic, really, considering that Britain is the country that most libertarian or classical liberal philosophers actually came from in the first place. All our ideas seem to have gone over the Atlantic.
We have got one, but he's either hated or loved, and that's Hitchens.
In last week's edition of the Libertarian Listener, we were talking about Peter Hitchens' article, and I thought it was quite astute in the way that it analyse the problem. But certain people think that he's not of the same intellect as his deceased brother.
I think they're on equal footings, but versed in totally different things. What do you reckon?
I'd say that's probably true, yes. I think one of the major issues that we've had, certainly this crisis has shown us, is that we've placed too much emphasis on specialist high-up views, when these views can change quite rapidly, and indeed have done in this case with the case of modelling that you were just on about. We're so reluctant nowadays to accept a more general view of things that it clouds people's opinions. And I think certainly in terms of the coronavirus, they're only willing to trust the view of a specialist and not really of a generalist who has a broader picture of things.
Yeah, that sounds true.
Nice. That pretty much wraps it for this edition of The Libertarian Listener. It's been great talking to you, Ben. I hope to have you on sometime in the future.
Thanks very much, Chris. I've enjoyed it.
Great. I'll see you next time then for more interviews.